One of the best ways to become a better homebrewer is to join a club. I'm a member of a club. I'm a member of the Olde Town Mash Paddlers here in Arvada, Colorado. Well, today I'm going to have the president of my club, Evan Sherlock, and he's going to join us today and talk about all things homebrewing clubs. Today on Homebrewing DIY. And welcome back to Homebrewing DIY, the podcast that takes on the do-it-yourself aspect of homebrewing. Gadgets, contraptions, and parts, this podcast covers it all. Today, we're talking to Evan Sherlock, and we're going to talk about all things homebrew clubs. Why, you ask, are we talking about homebrew clubs? Because there's no better way to learn other systems and how other people brew beer. First, let's dive into some feedback. I got an email from Chris Saunders, and he said, "Great podcast. I would love to hear more about your DIY fermenter and a little more detail on the controller. I've talked about my fermenter a few times on the show, but I can get into a little detail for you. First, my setup's from an old dorm fridge. The door is ripped off, and then I built a wood platform to set the fridge on. I then extended the front of the fridge by building a wood box out of OSB board. The controller that I built is using a classic brew pie setup. The instructions are on Homebrew Talk, and you can find them. Just look for Homebrew Talk, the Arduino setup, and you'll find it. Well, the software I currently run, though, is Fermentrack, and that setup has 3 temperature probes. Has one for beer temp, it has one for the room temp, and it also has one for the chamber temperature. Those 3 work in conjunction with a control algorithm to get me dialed to within a tenth of a degree. My beer probe also uses a thermowell. I have a stainless steel thermowell I bought from Brewers Hardware, and that fits right through the hole in the cork in the top of my fermenter and dips all the way into the beer, and that's actually where I put the temp probe. But if you wanted to build this today, there's a totally easier way, and I would highly recommend this. I'd say just get a chest freezer. You can find one probably secondhand or even brand new on something like Walmart.com. And to be honest, it's going to be a lot easier if you do it that way because there's not any construction, and it's going to hold temperatures a lot better. The other thing I would tell you is look at the Brew Pie remix by Lee Bussey. He was on this show, and go back and listen to that show. But if you go onto Homebrew Talk and look for his instructions or go to brewpieremix.com, he has a way of building a fermentation controller with the same control algorithm, but not having to do any type of soldering. You wouldn't have to solder. You don't have to do any of that. It just totally works, and you could use a couple wire nuts, and out of the box, you're ready to go. So, Chris, thanks for sending some feedback. And if anybody else had some feedback for the show, you can always send it to podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer. You can also reach out to us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, and just look for the handle @homebrewingdiy. You know, the show is something I love to do. I really want to let you know, though, it's hard work. And getting the show out every week is something that I work hard to do. And I'd love nothing more than to keep the show going strong. And the best way to do that is by supporting the show and supporting our efforts. You can always support us on Patreon. Head on over to patreon.com/homebrewingdiy and give any amount. With that, you're also going to get the special RSS feed that's going to allow you to become a patron, and you're also going to get ad-free shows as well as bonus episodes. You can also get special access to our Discord server, and I currently have a goal for the month of November to just try to get our first 10 Patreon supporters, and so you could be the first person. Once again, head over to patreon.com/homebrewing DIY. You can also support the podcast by reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, podchaser.com, or your favorite podcast service. That's how other people find the show, and it really helps if you give us a 5-star review. The last way you can support the show is by heading over to our website, homebrewingdiy.beer, and checking out Brewfather. If you click on the banner there, you can check out Brewfather, which is very powerful homebrewing software. You can build your recipes, it'll walk you right through your brew day, and it's just a great piece of software, and it's super easy to use. They have a free version, and if you go to homebrewingdiy.beer, click on the Brewfather banner and sign up today. The cool thing there is they do have a free version, but if you upgrade to the paid version, it will also give us a little bit of a kickback and help support the show. So now, let's hop into our interview. We're talking to Evan Sherlock, and we're going to talk about homebrew clubs. Well, I'm sitting here with Evan Sherlock of the Olde Town Mash Paddlers club that I'm gladly a member of, and he is a member and president of, and I'd like to welcome him to Homebrewing DIY. So welcome, Evan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So what we're going to talk about today is just homebrew clubs and really, what kind of support if you're a new homebrewer or really trying to learn or just trying to look for a bunch of guys to hang out with that are into homebrewing as well. I want to dive into the experience of a club and what that looks like. So that's why we have you here today. And I think the best place to start is actually going to be how you found your first club.
So this is the second homebrew club I've been a part of. It was back about 2002, 2003. I was living out in Oregon. And it was just a small, pretty informal type club that met at a homebrew shop there in Salem, Oregon, that I was part of. I can't even remember the name of the club at the time. And it was something that was a part of my life for, just a short moment there when I was really starting to get into homebrewing. But of course, my life changed. I moved back to Denver, and it wasn't until after I'd purchased my first house that I was like, yeah, this is real. I'm going to get really established with being a big part of homebrewing for a much longer period of time. And it was about 2013 is when I got real serious again. And that's when I sought out a club local to me. And that's when I found the Olde Town Mash Paddlers. And at that time, the club it looked a lot different than it does today. And it really fulfilled a lot of the needs I had as a homebrewer that was just starting to get into all grain and looking for a lot of the solutions and a lot of that camaraderie of homebrewing that I had lacking. Other than that, it was really me and a bunch of my college buddies drinking beer in my basement. And those guys weren't so into the nuances of how it was done. It was just the product.
That I have to admit that I run into that issue a lot, where I have friends and coworkers who drink my beer and I want to geek out about it. And, it's beer. They want to drink it, right? Sure.
And so when I joined the club back then, I was definitely one of the younger members at the time, and it was a lot more formal than we kind of are today. And I think there was a different kind of seriousness in the club. But that's really evolved over time. And, I've seen a lot of people come and go through this club, but the end goal always has been to surround yourself and kind of insulate yourself with the people that are into that same mentality and that same mental space. And for me, it's really, it drives me harder to want to get better and find those gains that I can get in my brewing experience. And a lot of that was facilitated just in these, informal conversations that we have at the club meetings that, they've been just gold as far as resources for myself in just developing the way I do things and understanding the process and eking out, all those efficiencies and the problem solving that is, an integral part of being a homebrewer is making the best product you can, but also understanding why you're making good product.
I think I completely agree there. I love going to the club meetings. I feel like every time I go to a club meeting, I do learn a little something new. And I'm not going to be somebody who admits that I'm not going to run around and be like I'm the best homebrewer in the world. I'm by far not. But I feel like little tidbits come out of every meeting, and for me, those little tidbits I add to my brewing. I change a little thing here and there, maybe off of a small conversation, and that's just from hanging out with a group of other homebrewers, right?
For sure, right, and I'll just definitely put it out there right now that the Olde Town Mash Paddlers is I would call it a social club, because we've been asked over the years, people want us to brew beer for events, or people want us to put on talks or brew sessions for organizations, and I've always kind of just stuck to the fact that we're a social club. We're self-serving. We're here to serve the guys that show up and are dedicated to making good beer and to talk about good beer. And we don't have, I know there's really organized clubs out there that put on big events and do charity things, and that's not the type of club we are. We are a strictly social club. And for me, it's really we meet once a month, and that the one meeting we have a month is one of the most fun evenings I have every month. Just I really look forward to it. I look forward to catching up with people that I've known for years now, and then also just getting a lot out of from those people in their experiences, because a lot of those guys are doing things that I might not necessarily have an interest in doing at the moment, or am active in doing, but those guys are working on different projects that are always at least interesting to hear about. And then always it's great when when those projects come full circle and they come back, like when we have guys that do barrel age projects, sometimes those can go on for years at a time. And then, you get to see the end product. And it's even fun when as a club, we do things like that, like barrel age projects, or we do, competition a couple times a year maybe, and we'll all do a similar style. And it's really fun to, talk about how they got there, what sets these beers apart, and even comparing our beers to commercial beers when we do competitions like that. It's just, it's a really satisfying thing that I probably couldn't get anywhere else. And I know there's times my wife just gets so sick of hearing, about the latest, greatest thing I'm geeking out on in homebrew. But at least I have that camaraderie with other people out there that are into the same kind of things.
I agree. And maybe that's a good place to kind of segue into the types of clubs that are out there. So let's say I'm a brand new homebrewer. I'm listening to this podcast, trying to learn to get better. And, I want to think about using a club as a resource. What kind of clubs would you say are out there that people could look for?
Well, I definitely know that there's a couple clubs even in the same town here that they're real formal. They'll do talks, they'll have very organized events. They'll have dues. They will have even multiple meetings a month, or even kind of smaller breakout sessions. And some of those clubs, you'll end up seeing upwards of sometimes like 50 guys at a meeting, and you really got to keep with like almost Robertson rules of meetings in that kind of scenario. And not to diss on those guys are doing great work and doing their own thing. But that's one type you might find. I know there's other types that are similar to ours, that is real informal, kind of off the cuff meetings. And the guys are just there to share their beer and get feedback. And that's generally something you're probably going to find almost anywhere, is you're always going to have guys that are going to come out and sample, and you're going to taste each other's beers, but it's really what you want to look for in a different in the type of club. I felt really fortunate that I was kind of well received right away by the Olde Town Mash Paddlers. Not only that, but it was a club that really kind of fit the needs I had.
Yeah, and I would agree. So for me, when I found the Mash Paddlers, it was something where I was looking for. I moved to a new city. I didn't really know a lot of people, and I was looking for some people that were into something that I was into, which was homebrewing beer. And I showed up at a meeting, and everybody was super cool. And I've kept going, and now I bring friends when I find out you're a homebrewer. You get to come to a club meeting with me. That's kind of at least my momentum. So how would you say, like, if I were going to find a club, what kind of things would you give me advice for in finding a club, and what kind of resources are out there?
The easiest way, and the way I found the Olde Town Mash Paddlers, is the American Homebrewers Association has a page where you can look up all of the homebrew clubs in your area, in your state, and it's real easy. I know I just scanned it prior to doing this podcast today, and just refreshing my memory how it looked. But a lot of them have links to their websites. We have a link to our website on the AHA website. And then as well, there's always contacts, and you can write, those people. And I had reached out to a few homebrew clubs. Funny enough, some of the clubs are real small and more informal than we are. I mean, at least our club is organized enough to meet once a month. Some of those clubs are clubs that might not even have regular meetings or even be that organized. They're just listed on the AHA website as being an organization that does exist. And those, I know there's a barrel-aged club here in Arvada that also operates, and some of those guys are part of our club. So it's just, it's reaching out and making that first contact, and then getting, asking, what a typical meeting might look like, where they would meet at, and then kind of going off that information, just, in your primary contact, and go out to a meeting and see if it's for you. I definitely support the idea of people building community, around home brewing, and the social aspect to me, I mean, as well as drinking beer, it's a social thing. It's about talking about it, and it's about being with the people and immersing yourself in that culture. And I think that's another great thing. I mean, I feel very fortunate that Colorado has a thriving craft beer scene that also really supports its homebrewers, and I really feel like those feed off of each other. Our meetings are held at a small craft brewery here in town. It's and they love having us, and it's a feedback cycle for them in a way too, that they get to see what we're doing. They'll come out and have samples with us. We'll talk about ingredients. They're brewers also, and it's a kind of I rub your back, you rub my back, and they support our club and we support their brewery, and it's a really nice kind of symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, and the locations, obviously depending on laws in your city or state are kind of how those things happen. Personally, I grew up in Utah. I learned to start homebrewing in Utah, and club meetings could never be held at a brewery. That would be so against the law there. But the clubs that I was a member of there, I was a member of a small club that started as a Facebook group, right? And it was the Toxic Pirates is what they were called, and it was a Facebook group in Salt Lake City, and it was a very informal club, right? But it was still that community and friends, getting together, talking about beer, being involved with brewing beer, and really just chumming up and hanging out and talking about beer. I would say, there is definitely an education piece to it, even in an informal club or a very formal club. What would you say is some things that you had no idea about and now know because of your homebrew club?
Oh, man. Shoot, there's a lot. Actually, the biggest, I'd say, kind of perk in that vein, I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, but is, group buys on grain is probably the coolest thing I've been, privy to in the time with the club. And also, for me, one of the other cool things about being part of the club and being witness to a lot of things is, man, some of these guys in our club and actually guys from other clubs that I've been privy to, being invited to their places and doing like barrel projects with, there are crazy engineers out there, and there are people driven to have some seriously insane brew setups in their house, and seeing all those kind of things, you wouldn't get that. You don't get the same feeling as, yeah, it's cool to look at guys' setups online and scan Reddit and look at photos and look at what guys have. But man, going over to somebody's house and being part of a brew day and just, immersing yourself in their different system, because everybody brews so radically different, even though we're talking about similar processes. I mean, everybody's equipment is different. Everything's going to react different. The way they do things, the steps they take, just the immense amount of information that you're going to get just by being part of a community and putting yourself in that community is something that just, it feeds such a great part of my mind, like knowing things and experiencing things. You couldn't buy it. Those are experiences that you couldn't get off the internet. There's a lot of clubs that operate online, and there's a lot of communities that are supporting homebrewing online. You look at Homebrew Talk and the amount of threads and data in there. It's always a nice buttress of information, but it's one of those things, sitting down and having a beer with a guy and talking to a guy and brewing on his system with him is such a different experience than it is, reading comments online and really trying to read between the lines of the information you're finding online. And not to knock, guys that are part of homebrew clubs online. It's just such a different experience being with people and seeing things and participating, at a really hands-on level with these guys.
I completely agree. I feel like every time I go with a co-club member and either hang out with them while they're brewing on their system, or we brew together on their system, I learn something new, because maybe they approach mashing a different way. Maybe they have a small tweak that they do. I think everybody calls it their brick, right? There's I don't know who said it, but the idea is that you kind of have this one little hack that everybody has in their brewery. Like, for example, you might be a wire hanger to hold a funnel in a certain place, or it could be a brick to hold the door open so that you can get the hose in. But everybody kind of has that thing in their brewery, and it can kind of be tweaked to your own brewery too. And it's that kind of learning and you get from experience that really changes subtle things that over time can end up becoming your beer.
Oh, certainly. It's such a hands-on process to begin with, but to me, it's out of necessity too. I mean, like, I still do infusion mashes in, giant Coleman cooler. And, over the years, that thing's a little more warped than it used to be. And do I have ways to keep that lid down and nice and tight? Of course, I've got some spare, weights hanging around that I keep just to keep that lid closed while I mash. It's all those kind of small things, but it's always an evolution too. Every brewer I know, it's not a static activity. And I think that's one of my favorite things about the homebrewing community. It's really a lot of people that are similar minded, that they see the world as malleable, and they see the world as it can change, any moment, because you're going to have to react, because in the middle of mashing, something changes. You have to react because you want to preserve the time and money you've put into it. But it's also just necessity. You need to see that beer through. It's like, you're growing something, you're making something.
Yeah, I completely agree. What kind of projects have you guys done together as a brew club? I've done a couple things with you, but what kind of, like, you talked about barrel projects, but what kind of other projects have you guys done together as a club?
Some of the things we do, I mentioned it earlier, we like to do competitions at least once a year. We got a couple guys that really push that one. So what we elect to do is we pick a style, and believe me, it's so hard to get 20 some guys to sit down and adhere to AHA, guidelines, or, the homebrewer guidelines on style, but we'll try to pick those through, and we'll pick a subcategory. And it might be, this last year, for whatever reason, we decided to do Belgian beers in July, which was an extraordinarily silly meeting. But we picked the Belgian beers, and everybody had 4 months to crank out a Belgian beer. We all brought them and sampled them, and we compared them against blind comparison against commercial styles. And that's always a really fun meeting because to us, it really sets the bar for are we even playing in the same game as commercial beers? And definitely, I can say there's a lot of guys in our club that are, making beer at that level that is that good, And also, it's one of those things I really like that because you even get those beers to come back, in subsequent meetings. And when those beers come back, you can even kind of perceive the changes. And you go back and when we take notes on all these beers, and we get to see how those change. Some of the other things we do is we've got a guy in our club that has a hop farm, Voss Hops. Shout out to Voss. And he has us out once a year. He'll always do some barbecue, and we'll help him pick hops, which is always a real fun meeting. We'll usually do that like on a Saturday in the middle of the day. And we've even done it while people are picking hops. We have guys bring out their partial or full brew systems, and we'll knock out, handful of batches with like wet hops, which is always a fun time, and especially having a little barbecue and beers to drink. Some of the other things we've done is we've assisted with some local beer competitions and getting submissions to those guys. The Arvada on Tap Festival, we've been pretty integral in the homebrewing piece when they still had it. They got rid of it this last year. Trying to think. We've also done some stuff with a couple different breweries in town. One, we've taken tours as a club, which is always really fun. You get to geek out and look at other people's really big shiny toys, which you don't always get to do. But it's fun to experience that with the guys that you're hanging out with and talking beer with most of the time, anyhow. And then also we've done brew days at different breweries where we kind of elect which beer goes forward for maybe a kind of smaller club competition, and we'll scale those up and brew beers on a commercial system. And it's actually turned out that the place we meet up at, Someplace Else Brewing, they still have my Kentucky Common recipe on tap. Here it is. It's been a couple years now, but I think that thing's been on the rotator for 2 years. So that's really fun to see, that I know that I had a part in one of their beers that they always have around.
Which is funny because that's actually my go-to beer every time I go to the meeting. It's like, the pint I buy when I walk in the doors, I always get the Kentucky Common. So
well, it's also kind of a light beer, and when you're at a meeting where you're only going to just drink more beers, it's not too shabby to have around. I think it only 4%, so it's
exactly. I try to have a nice little light beer before I get into some barrel aged 10%ers. But yeah, let's talk a bit about like if you were to want to start your own club. Let's say I'm in a city that doesn't have a club or a small town, and I want to kind of get one going. What kind of resources are out there for that?
I do know, especially with the origins of our club here, the Olde Town Mash Paddlers, it really just started out, and I'm not a founding member by any length. It was our buddy Gordon and Dean. Both those guys, they got their start just they were sitting around at the bar drinking beer. And Gordon had been brewing for a while. I know Dean was getting into it, and they said, we should start a club. And, there was a handful of the regulars at the bar there, and they kind of tossed this idea around. And next thing they know, they got just a touch organized and found a meeting spot at one of the, the local brew pubs here in Arvada, and they got going, and they started setting meeting dates, and the rest was really organic. That they end up talking to a few other people. They find other people at the homebrew shops, talk to those guys, put some information out at the homebrew shops. We know where they're meeting and kind of what they're doing, and the rest just grew. And I was there only about a year and a half after they got started, and I've watched the club grow and change, and we've kind of become a little something different than our origins were. But I still think the whole spirit is there. That it's about people talking about their passionate hobby. But I would definitely say if you're interested in starting a club, it doesn't have to be super formal. You can kind of throw some information out there to the homebrew stores, and I would say definitely make connections with your local brew pubs. And the rest, I think would probably, just getting listed on the AHA website. The rest is going to happen. You just need a little networking, and I think you would be surprised. I know when we overhauled our email communication list about a year and a half ago, we had upwards of we had 110 people on the list. It's not like we were getting 110 people at the meetings, but it had gone that far, and from something that really just started as two guys talking about making beer, at the bar, it turned into something, and we've been going strong since 2012. So here we are, year 7, and things are going great.
Yeah, and if you're in a town or you're in a smaller city and you can't find that club you want, you can just, 2 people talking about beer can be a club. It doesn't need to be that big.
No, definitely not. And I didn't know what to expect ever going to my first meeting. I was even intimidated. Do I even bring beer? I didn't know the rules. I didn't know how that worked. I didn't know if you could bring beer into brew pubs. All this I've kind of learned. At least Colorado's got some reasonable laws on the books that we can bring those in, and it's condoned. But yeah, I'd say it's the community aspect. Even if you have a few people talking about the hobby, that's going to push it, and I'm not here to sell homebrewing to anybody. Get into it if you want to. But, I think the fact is I've bought it hook, line, and sinker, and a lot of other guys have too. And it grows, it's a really organic experience. It's really nice just to have those conversations, and it's so much easier to learn with other people than going out there and doing it on your own. Yeah, I mean, I could read every John Palmer book out there, but it doesn't mean it's going to have a huge impact. It's really when the rubber hits the road and you're brewing and you're trying new things and experimenting, and it's sharing all that those experiences. I brew, really low gravity English beers are my favorite. We've got guys in the club that are, totally experienced in doing, their own things, barrel projects, really high gravity beers. Some guys that are doing meads, some guys that are really into doing like IPAs, or guys that are into doing Belgians, guys that only do bottle conditioning. It's far and wide, and all these guys are into different things. But when you end up having those questions about maybe changing equipment or getting into like a DIY project, there's somebody hopefully that you can turn to as a resource that's going to have a lot of that information and really help you shortcut, your processes. I've gotten a handful of people into brewing myself over the years, and I look at the speed which they accelerated getting into all grain and, doing like decoction mashes and such. Blew my mind. I was like, holy smokes, that took me years to get to those points. But it's really nice to see them really get to the point where they're enjoying their beer faster at a better rate of return, than I did. I can remember, when I was really into brewing, I was, I'd moved out to Oregon after I was out of college, and I was really kind of out there alone. And it was just kind of getting shortcut by some of those guys in the first club I was in. They helped me here and there, but I ended up moving not long after. But it's just nice to have the resources available, and especially in our club, it's abundant. I mean, I know guys that I can go to with kegging questions. I know I have questions I can go to with guys like hardware questions or mechanical type questions like motorization of things. I mean, and all these guys also have, homebrewing is just a small facet of their mind, is how I look at it, because, I've got a bunch of other stuff that I'm into. I'm really into technology and computers, and as well as building things in the fine arts. And, I know there's also guys out in our club that there's a ton of gearheads. I can rely on them to, if I even had car questions or other things, or guys that are super into gardening, it doesn't just stop at beer also, it's really nice just having these people as friends, and as part of your life, that it's just resourceful. And anybody that's into beer, I always find, is just generally kind of handy, and into doing their own thing and not afraid.
Yeah. And that's kind of really the idea of this show, right, is that if you're into homebrewing, and I feel like every homebrewer kind of, homebrewing in itself is a DIY process, right? You've decided I am going to make beer from grain.
Oh, for sure. That was like the coolest thing the first time I ever heard you could make beer too. You know, I mean, that brings me back. Like, I have control, you know?
Exactly. And then taking that DIY process, and it becomes this thing. And like you said, I like the facet where we're all kind of engineers in our own way. The systems and the setups that we all have are individual to oneself, and that's how come, you know, my beer has a specific flavor that is my beer, right? And your beer is going to have a specific flavor that's your beer. And Jim, who was on my show, I think episode 3, his beers always have stellar beers.
Oh man,
yeah, his beers are great, by the way. But they always have a flavor that's his. And it's all because our systems are kind of as individual as we are.
Oh, absolutely. It's diverse and it's fun, and I really see it just as like a, you know, melting pot of personalities, people, and it's as unique as their beer. You know, it's such a great time, and honestly, I just, you know, people give me crap all the time. You know, oh, you're the president, you keep this thing going. You know, honestly, to me, it's the least I can do for the other side of it, the experience side. And, you know, just keeping up with the newsletter and doing the minutes. I mean, that's basically what keeps us as a quote unquote organized club. But, you know, it's a privilege to be with a lot of these guys. You know, it's so much fun. And I really get a kick out of just every facet of the experience of the Homebrew Club. And I couldn't endorse it enough. You know, a lot of people, when they talk to me about brewing, you know, my number one thing is it's talking more about my club than it is so much more about my beer, because the club justifies the insane amount of money and time that I invest into the hobby, because it's coming full circle. It's the information I have is going out to other people, and the information other people have is, you know, it's a self-feedback loop. I'm getting a lot out of it.
So, what are you brewing right now?
Right now, I have a Southern English Brown that I brewed up. It was, yeah, you stopped by that day. It's in the fermenter still. I haven't taken out. I just got a new racking cane in the mail this week. I was waiting on a stainless steel one. I've been wanting one for some time, so I was waiting until that came in the mail to transfer it. So I'll probably be transferring that out. And, you know, the reason I brewed it was on Homebrew Finds a while back. I ran across the Conan yeast strand, and it came out of Australia. It came in dry form, and I was thrilled because I was a huge fan of Conan yeast a couple of years back when I was obsessed with, you know, finding a can of heady topper. But, you know, it was one of those things. I was really obsessed with the Conan yeast, and I got it the first time I ever got it was out of the Yeast Bay, which I think is San Francisco there. And, you know, I propagated that thing up to, I probably went through 12 generations of that yeast on the stir plate. But I really found I enjoyed it in my English. It's an English beer strain, but I really enjoyed it in my English browns. And so I was really happy to find that yeast strain back. And so I thought, yeah, if I ordered up like 4 packets of the dry yeast, I was like, yeah, go ahead and do another Southern English brown.
And to talk a bit about the DIY side of it, I know you're doing an entire brewery in your basement, and it's been an ongoing project, but you know, where are you in that project, and what's the overall plan?
So where I'm at is, you know, I a couple years back had, you know, ran into the electric brewery, and this whole site Cal had thrown together in his original setup. And, you know, I got really geeked on that. And this was before a lot of that stuff was really commercially viable, or I guess commercially available, you know, all these electric systems. And so I, at one point, started amassing all of the hardware to do this. But of course, towards the end of amassing all the hardware, I had a toddler at home, and it just didn't happen. And then it was about last year, I kind of got re-excited about the project. And we had a mother-in-law kitchen in our basement, and I ripped the entire thing out and put in floor drains. I ended up with like, a commercial dish station somehow off Craigslist. It's kind of become its own animal. It's become a way bigger project than I ever dreamed, but I'm happy I'm doing it the right way. And so the next kind of steps here are I'm running a 60 amp sub panel down to my basement and going all electric rims. And so I'm hoping to get that online here. I'm hoping in the next maybe 2-3 months. But it's turned into an animal of a project. But, I always saw it as like the forever upgrade. Some of the guys in our club had gotten these intense brew setups. And I was like, when will I ever, end up with something like that? And well, piece by piece, here I am getting there. It's just, it's been a long road to where I'm at now. But, I've got my brewery, the room built out. It's just now getting to all the nuts and bolts of an electric system, which is incredibly daunting at this point, cutting up a panel and wiring everything and making sure I don't burn down my house. But other than that, but yeah, I'm hoping that maybe you'll have me back at some point once I get that thing wrapped up and maybe have you over for a brew day. Cause I'm hoping that thing's just going to be sweet beyond belief, but it's a lot. I've still got some road to travel till that thing's done.
Actually, I think what we should do is you have me over for a brew day, and I'll bring my recorder over, and you can give me a tour through it, and we'll just call that an episode.
I would love it. That'd be great. Yeah, awesome. We can knock out some beers then.
Well, Evan, I want to thank you for coming on the show and talking about brew clubs and how to start one, and really great reasons to be a part of one. And I just want to thank you for coming on the show, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you having me. I love it. Yeah, I will. I'll be seeing you at the next meeting.
Yes, you will. See you later.
All right. Thanks so much.
I'd like to thank Evan for coming on the show. It was really great to talk to him, and now we know a little bit more about homebrewing clubs. Also, please don't forget, you can always support the show by heading on over to patreon.com/homebrewingdiy. Also, find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Look for the handle @homebrewingdiy. Well, that's it for today's show, and we'll see you next week on Homebrewing DIY.